In this video, we're going to take a general look at what some of the components of a control system are. In later units, we're going to come back and we're going to look at specific systems and be able to relate these various components to specific physical things. But again, right now, we're going to keep things pretty general and vague. So here I have a relatively simple block diagram showing a control system. So everything circled in this blue dashed line is part of our control system. And so of course on either side of that we have an input on the left and an output on the right. And so those two things I think are pretty self-explanatory. So sometimes though we might see these called something a little different. So our input is just our controlled input being applied to the system. Sometimes this is going to be called the reference. So sometimes called the reference. And then again, our output, of course, is just going to be the output of the system. And sometimes this is going to be called our controlled variable. So now with the other things, I don't necessarily want to go through here and just go left to right, but I think it's going to make more sense to start with what is our process or our plant. So let's first take a look at this piece here, our process or plant. And so what that is that's just our system or subsystem that we're wanting to control. So system slash subsystem to be controlled. And so an example of this, to help sort of make sense of this, would be a furnace in a factory. So maybe we want to control the temperature, how hot the furnace is burning in a factory. So that's our process or our plant. So the next thing we want to look at is our controller. So our controller is just our system that is designed to drive the plant or process to give us our desired output. So system designed to drive that plant process, which we just defined earlier, to give whatever our desired output is. So with our furnace example, maybe that desired output is a certain temperature. So examples of this controller, if we're talking about our furnace example, we could say something like fuel valves, so allowing a certain amount of fuel to go in based on our performance and what we want. And maybe we have some electrical controls that are part of that system as well. Okay, so another important component that we see here is our input transducer. So what our input transducer is doing is it's taking our form of the input and it's going to convert it to whatever form our controller needs. So we talked about this in a previous video when we were talking about why our control system is useful, and we said convenience of input form. So what our transducer is doing is it's converting that input to the form needed by the controller. So converting input to form used by controller. So sort of deviating from that furnace example, I think, at least for me, one of the easier ones to sort of help make this concept a little clearer is a pressure transducer. And so with a pressure transducer, what we can think of doing is we're converting a pressure to an electrical signal. And so of course there are many different types of transducers, and which one you use is going to depend on what type of input form you want to have and what type of controller you have. A couple of other things to point out here. So those are sort of the main parts, but a couple other important things as well. We see we have these little circles here, and they're sort of divided into 4 pieces inside. And in each of these 2 circles, we just have plus signs in certain quadrants. And so what these are called are summing junctions. And so what our summing junctions are just locations where we're algebraically summing different signals coming in. So summing junctions are what those are called, and these are just algebraic sums. So algebraic sums of inputs. So whatever we have coming in this case we have two signals, one here, so we're just adding both of those because we have an addition sign in each case. But we can have subtraction, which we'll see a little later on. One thing to point out too is you'll notice that all of these sort of directions, all of these, the connections here are arrows pointing in one direction. So we only have one direction that we can be moving through this control system. So that's another important thing to keep in mind. So the last thing I want to point out here are these two disturbances. We have disturbance 1 and disturbance 2. And in our previous video, we talked about a couple examples. We said if we have a large antenna, we're trying to control the position of it. We have a big gust of wind that could move it out of the desired position. So that would be an example of a disturbance. And so what our disturbances are just unexpected or uncontrolled inputs. So unexpected or uncontrolled inputs to the system. And so that covers our sort of basics at a general level, sort of everything's still a little bit vague. In the next video, what we're going to come back and talk about sort of different system configurations and how we can differentiate between systems that can handle these disturbances and systems that can't handle these disturbances as well.